There is an idea, whether spoken or unspoken, that success in music, or any creative field really, follows a predictable timeline. The mythology often suggests that by a certain age an artist should have made it, whatever that means. That their path should be clear, their audience secured, their place in the industry established. And if it hasn't happened by that time, then maybe it never will. And then there are stories like Nels Cline's that defy that idea entirely. Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Born and raised in Los Angeles, California, Cline's story is deeply intertwined with that of his twin brother, drummer Alex Cline. As children, they were inseparable, feeding each other's artistic obsessions from collecting art books to discovering rock and jazz records. Their early love for the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and the burgeoning counterculture of the late 1960s propelled them toward music. Alex eventually chose the drums, and Nels picked up the guitar. All these years later, to talk to Nels Cline, you can almost imagine him as a kid. Wide-eyed, devouring music, building a vocabulary of sounds and ideas. He speaks in a kind of musical shorthand where albums, artists, and moments in time are all deeply connected. His relationship with music is very personal, visceral, a kind of saving grace, and a complicated mistress. For decades, Cline lived hand-to-mouth, balancing a life in avant-garde jazz, punk, and improvisational music, with day jobs in record stores and bookstores, scraping by while making bold, uncompromising art. The gigs he played often didn't pay the rent. The albums that he recorded often went largely unheard. But he stayed true to a vision that had no guaranteed payoff. And then, at nearly 50 years old, everything changed. In 2004, he was invited to join Wilco, a band that was already well established but on the verge of its own evolution. Suddenly, Nels had stability, a wider audience, and a new role as the lead guitarist in a rock band. And for many, that might have felt like a final destination, a well-earned arrival after years of struggle. But for Nels, it was really just the next chapter. Even with the security of Wilco, he never stopped exploring, pushing, searching. Cline remains as restless as ever. His latest record, Consentrik Quartet, is a reflection of that tenacity. It's an album shaped by contradictions, stillness and movement, noise and silence, structure and improvisation. A fitting metaphor for an artist whose career has been anything but conventional. Nels Cline reminds us that there is no universal timeline for artists. Some find their moment early, some never find it at all, and some, like Nels, stay the course through decades of uncertainty only to arrive somewhere unexpected. And even then, they keep searching. We spoke recently about that search, what keeps him going, and the path that leads from psychedelia to the avant-garde. Third-story.com is where you'll find the full archive featuring hundreds of conversations, many of which pair beautifully with this one, like my interviews with Julian Lage, Michael Lenhart, and Todd Sikafus. Subscribe to my Substack for the latest episodes, stories, and musings. That's leosidran.substack.com. Listen, rate, and review The Third Story anywhere you get your podcast. It really helps other people discover the show. And remember that we are made in partnership with WBGO Studios. Visit wbgo.org/studios to explore their award-winning music and storytelling. Here's me and Nels Cline talking it down.
I want to get the story. I know that you're in the cycle of talking about the record and your story and doing press. I actually was just looking for videos of you yesterday on YouTube and happened to tune into you doing this live stream on a guitar channel. So I know that you're in the mode of talking about yourself a lot right now and gear and the project and all that stuff. But I just want to kind of get the general arc of you and how we landed here, because I think it's pretty fascinating, particularly the sort of origin story of you and your twin brother in California growing up together. There are a lot of different kinds of twins. As I understand it, you are really twins. You're not fraternal twins. You're mirror images of each other.
Yeah, we're mirror twins, which is a type of identical twin. And as I understand it, and I could be wrong, it's the type of identical twin that separates like at the sort of the last minute before potentially being conjoined twins, which is conjoined twins really scare the hell out of me. So it's a little eerie when I think about it. But yeah, I mean, and we did everything together growing up. Much of that had to do with us being obsessed with music and playing together.
Were your parents musical?
There are no musicians in our entire family tree that anyone knows about, but my parents definitely had a love of music. Our mother had been a singer as a girl in her church in South Dakota, and it wasn't even really a town. It's so small where she was from. And then she apparently won a contest, but then hated the idea of competition and never sang in front of anyone again, except that my parents both could carry a tune and both had well, they were both school teachers in the Los Angeles City school system, but they had many artistic abilities, which I took for granted when I was growing up. But then when I reflect on it now, it's really quite remarkable that they were both really good at drawing freehand. Mm. They both could write eloquently. They could write poetry. They could create drama pieces or comedy, especially my dad, who loved to be on stage. And I think probably did teach drama at one point.
Was your dad also from South Dakota or from the Midwest?
No, he's from Los Angeles, where we grew up. Yeah, although he mostly grew up in San Pedro, Los Angeles' harbor, which is about a half-hour drive. Well, now it's probably an hour.
Yeah, right.
But he was born downtown Los Angeles, as Alex and I were as well. And my parents, if somebody, for example, accidentally in a sentence said a song title, usually from a musical. My parents loved musicals, or what we now call a jazz standard, something that was a pop song in the 40s. They would just break into song and sometimes start sort of dancing around the kitchen, and they could sing. They could sing in tune, and they were very supportive of art and culture, fortunately for Alex and me, because it's all we really cared about when we were, by the time we were 10.
It's a lovely LA story because you generally hear these stories of kids who grow up in the shadow of the industry and they have an awareness of music as being tied to a business or, opportunity. And what you're describing is really the arts as just being something that is alive in your life, not necessarily something that you would aspire to try to make a living at, but just something that you do because you love.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that very naively, we assumed that artists made a living because we loved art so much and we were listening to music and we were collecting or accumulating, I should say, art books. The ultimate pleasure, besides going to record stores, was going with our folks to the department store and going to the remainder table and being told, yeah, you can pick out an art book, and back then we were talking about Abrams monographs. We're talking about those beautiful little Skira monographs with the tipped in plates. And we were, very absorbed with mostly painters, but not exclusively. My brother was very focused on Picasso, and then the surrealists, Max Ernst being a big favorite of his, and I was very much the Juan Miro and Albrecht Dürer guy at that point. And then we just sort of expanded from there. And by the time the so-called counterculture or hippie culture was happening, and we were sort of entering puberty around then, which was pretty baffling, we were just absorbed with rock and roll for the most part. And then later jazz and prog and whatever you want to call things.
So he's Picasso, you're Juan Miro. He plays the drums at some point. He chooses the drums are going to be his instrument and you pick up a guitar. How did you settle on those two instruments? And was there any sort of discussion about it? Or how did that happen?
No, there was no discussion. My brother was instantly interested in drums. When we had a friend in elementary school named Pat Pyle, who was a really accomplished drummer at a very young age. And I remember us going to his house after school one day because he wanted to show us his snare drum exercises. And I remember him playing drum rudiments on his snare drum. And Alex and I were literally giddy. We were we couldn't, I remember my face hurting because I was grinning so broadly. And Alex was as well. And then so he immediately wanted to play drums. And Pat was a very generous boy. He let Alex come over and play his drum set anytime he wanted. So on weekends, sometimes Alex and Pat would take turns playing along with Rolling Stones songs. My brother was very focused on the Rolling Stones at this point. So that's why I know pretty much every Charlie Watts fill up to about Exile on Main Street, when we started to drift away from that style of music. And then Pat's uncle had a bass, like a little cheap Italian bass and a Crown combo amp. And so I would just run my hands up and down the bass and just be completely transported. So the next leap for me was, logically, I guess, was electric guitar. But really the first instrument I thought about learning was the sitar. We both heard Ravi Shankar when our teacher in the 5th grade, but we were studying India, played an entire side of a Ravi Shankar live record on World Pacific with Alla Rocca on tabla. And I was absolutely, I was just completely transported. I was blown away. I became obsessed with the sitar. And at that time, this is about 1966, Ravi Shankar actually had a school, an Indian music school in Los Angeles. So I was really thinking that maybe I should try to get into this school, until I read his first autobiographical book, My Music, My Life, which was slender compared to the tome that came out later. And he describes his practice regimen, how he learned sitar. And it's so rigorous. I just said, there's no way. There's really no way I'm going to do this. So I think I'll just try to be a cool kid and play electric guitar. And I was really into the Byrds. So that was kind of maybe, along with surf music, like Dick Dale style surf music, was probably my impetus or my inspiration guitar-wise at first.
And then I understand there was a Hendrix moment that seemed to be pretty expansive for you, or kind of mind-blowing.
It was literally like being catapulted into some sort of stratospheric new world. Yeah, that was Manic Depression being played on the AM radio, which is still baffling to both of us, to Alex and me, because that wasn't the single. Purple Haze was the single. And we hadn't heard any Jimi Hendrix yet. We had seen the album when it came out, and we used to buy records just based on what they looked like for the most part. And we would save up our allowance and buy a record every 2 weeks. And quite often, the albums weren't as great as the singles that were from the albums. So we looked at the Jimi Hendrix album and we said, this has to be one of the coolest records ever made, just from looking at it. When you look at the cover, you look at what they look like, you look at Jimmy, the jacket with the eyes on it, the fisheye lens, everything about it. And then as soon as Manic Depression came on, we knew that it was that record, because we could tell it was like black dudes singing. It was a trio. We just knew. And we were literally jumping up and down, freaking out. And that was it. That's the moment I said, all I want to do is play guitar. I want to participate in music, whatever it takes. Sounds really like apocryphal and dramatic, but it was.
I'm very struck by the image of the two of you feeding off of each other's enthusiasm and energy and loving the same thing or versions of the same thing, which I imagine was probably very useful at that time to have an ally, who's deeply into it with you.
Yeah, I mean, it was not exactly a recipe for socialization, especially later, because later we got interested in music that none of our friends were interested in, or at least almost none, which was to say instrumental music, jazz-related, jazz rock, avant-garde, improvised music. That was high school. But in terms of rock bands, for example, we listened to everything together, or records, you could just say. We listened to everything together, but we each had our sovereign selections.
Was there one record player in the house?
Yeah. Eventually there were two, but yeah, there was one, it had a radio in it, and it was mono, or it had 3 speakers, but it was not stereo. And it was a big box. We would really basically like all the same stuff, but then every once in a while we'd get into a little disagreement about something, but it never meant that we were fighting over anything or about anything. I heard so much Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, and that was another obsession of my brother's. I mean, he was really deeply into Frank Zappa. Now I can hear Frank Zappa sometimes in my own playing, even though I wasn't worshiping Frank Zappa like my brother was, but I heard him pretty much every day for years, Sure.
And not only are you listening to music, but you're both learning to play music at this time. Were you playing together? Were you just jamming together all the time? What was your musical life together as players?
I'll first say that Alex was kind of good right away. He just had it, and I was definitely not. And in those days, there were no YouTube videos to watch to learn how to do anything on the guitar. So I didn't even know how to tune a guitar. But my dad bought a little Japanese electric guitar, a Melody, 1 pickup, sort of half-size electric guitar that I still have from a student. And I just played everything with my thumb and on my right hand and 2 fingers up and down the high E string with the open B. That was how I played. And my dad at one point decided he wanted to take folk guitar lessons at a night school. So he got a cheap nylon string guitar and he went to night school and came back and showed me an E chord. And that was the biggest revelation of my early life right there. A few years later, it was when a guy showed me a diatonic scaling chords. And then I realized, oh, this is how music works and how music's put together. But I was a complete primitive and had no idea how to play like a normal guitar player, and played really with two fingers well into high school. And then I taught myself how to play with all my fingers. I looked at how Steve Howe from Yes and Julian Bream, the great classical guitarist, Ralph Towner, how they played with all their fingers, and tried to imitate that. We had a band that didn't play anywhere except at our elementary school graduation. And we played 3 original songs and I never learned how to play other like Beatles riffs. Like, really the cool kids could play, Day Tripper or Paperback Rider riff or something like that. And I never learned any of that stuff, So when I got the E chord under my fingers, then we had a song, and Alex and I would get together and I would just turn on a fuzz box and play E, and he'd play it 4/4 beat. And that would be our new song. It sounds kind of like the first Wire album, Pink Flag. There's a track on there that sounds so much like we did in a weird way. We just wanted to play our own music. It never occurred to us to like become a bar band or anything and then play all the hits of the day to make money. So that for sure, we just wanted to do our own thing. That doesn't mean it was good, though. It was definitely not visionary in a Shagsian kind of way.
All right, so you start playing in this band. Obviously, you're young. If it's your elementary school graduation, you discover the E chord, you got a fuzz box. And then did you eventually learn to play other people's music, or what was your ambition? What were you aspiring to do as you got a little older?
In junior high school, we met this boy named Bill Watts, who's a fantastic guitar player. And he really did, in I think Alex would agree, the way we remember his sound, he played very much like Eric Clapton in Cream. We got together with our friend Alan and started to play instrumental jam tunes that had simple themes, very simple, rocking out and then soloing kind of things. And we played, 1 or 2 gigs. It was impossible to figure out where to play if you were under 16, We played in the park, and we played, I think we played a handful of cover songs. And I was the singer, by the way.
It sounds like you also at this period are absorbing a lot. You were aware of what other guitar players sounded like, different aspects that you were maybe trying to borrow or figure out or at least aware of.
My, I guess, general aesthetic, without knowing anything at the time, was to listen to people who added what is basically the 9th and 6th scale degrees a lot, because it sounded jazzy to me.
Yeah.
And I liked that sound. And in the rock and roll world, the people who were doing that to great effect were like my main guy, Duane Allman, at that time. Carlos Santana. Peter Frampton with Humble Pie. And then later I became aware of people like Jan Ackerman, Jan Ackerman was playing all kinds of really weird notes and with amazing technique and very strident tone. But by then I was much more informed by the time I was listening to those guys,
So what did you do after high school? You went to this high school called University High School. Is that what it was called?
Yep.
And then after that was over, you stayed in LA for a while.
Oh, I stayed in Los Angeles for 50 years. I was told it was too late to do music studies as my major. That I was starting too late, because it was in high school that I realized, having listened to, let's say, George Benson, Pat Martino. Wes Montgomery. Joe Pass. Then Jim Hall. And I'm trying to figure out, wow, I've got to really learn how to play now because I want to play more of that kind of music, right? Well, I never had any guitar lessons that helped. Actually, I became kind of psychologically tormented by my alleged guitar teacher in high school.
How so?
Well, it's just a boring story, but I wanted to learn how to read music, and I wanted to learn what I thought were, jazz harmonies, jazz chords. And he had no business trying to teach either one of these, and it was really kind of like a big psychological dude torment competition sort of thing. And he was a terrible teacher. So I thought I was never going to understand music. Anyway, not to go too far with that, I was going to go to college. We had good grades and everything. Alex was going to study visual art because he was a gifted painter and could draw beautifully. And I was going to be a philosophy major. So I went to Occidental College, which is a very, very nice, small, private college.
Yeah, I think Obama spent some time there, actually.
He did indeed. Maybe about 4 or 5 years after I was there. But I wanted to stay in Los Angeles. I didn't know about any place where I could study and play electric guitar, except for Berkeley in Boston. That was the only place I'd heard of it. I realize now that probably North Texas State had a program and University of Miami, but I didn't know that. And I didn't want to go to any of those places. I wanted to stay in Los Angeles because Alex and I had a band. At this point, our high school band stopped playing. We had an instrumental band. So I wanted to stay with this band, and work on this music. And I quit Occidental College after a year, realizing that my parents were paying a lot of money. It was really expensive, and I'm sure it still is. And that I wasn't going to be a philosopher. I wasn't going to be a philosophy teacher. I wanted to play. So I went at the last minute, I enrolled at Santa Monica College, which is where people in my area went when they couldn't get into a fancy college. But I just wanted to start over. And I ended up with a theory teacher named Rule Beasley, who changed my life, honestly. And he's the father of John Beasley, who's a very well-known jazz pianist and arranger in Los Angeles, who was quite the amazing piano player in high school. But anyway, it's important to know that I never finished college.
As you say, you spent the majority of your life in LA, and a lot of it playing what people refer to often as avant-garde music. I think you probably became a name that was more familiar with more people when eventually, which now is 20 years ago, you joined Wilco, which was already an established band. And it's interesting to me both that they thought it was something that they would want to bring into their world, and that you thought it was a world that you would want to get involved in, like two different trajectories that came together in a moment.
Yeah.
What was happening with you at that time before you joined Wilco? Where were you at in your life before that happened?
I was struggling to survive playing creative music in California primarily. And I was playing in my band, the Nels Cline Singers. Which had replaced my previous trio, which was called Nels Cline Trio. And Nels Cline Trio anchored a concert series for a few years that I did on Monday nights at a place in Santa Monica called the Alligator Lounge, and that hosted improvisers from all over the world, ultimately, but initially was designed to showcase all the creative improvisers that we could find, and I would book them. And I also became reinvested in rock and roll, not right when the punk thing happened, in say 76 or so. I started working at Rhino Records in West Los Angeles at 76. And so I heard everything. I heard every Consignment single. I had no interest in that scene because I was trying to learn how to play. I was the guy with the Tibetan bag and the Indian muslin shirt and the Ralph Towner records, and so all this kind of like, form a band and make a 7-inch single a week later kind of activity was not interesting to me. And it also seemed a little bit too fashion forward in Los Angeles because it was a very Hollywood thing. And the mask, you basically had to look a certain way, it seemed. But eventually I found this band called Television, this record, Marquee Moon. And so as I drifted gradually back into rock and roll, the big moment for me was when I realized who the Minutemen were. And so as we were listening in the record store to What Makes a Man Start Fires, I was really struck by how many things timbrally, melodically, and rhythmically were happening on that record that reminded me of stuff that Alex and I had done when we were younger. Minutemen, for me, when I saw them, was when I realized that the so-called scene and I were now going to have something to do with each other. Yeah, because the Minutemen were one of the greatest live bands of all time, in my opinion. And they were just so strikingly original and so unobviously poetic.
So through most of your professional life in LA, when you were not on the road, you would work in a record store or a bookstore.
Yeah, or a record distributor. So that was about 18 years of day job. And then I'd play at night or rehearse, and when I think about how many different things I was doing in the 80s, it's kind of startling to me. But I didn't start my own band until 89. That was my trio. I was in a group called Quartet Music. That was an acoustic sort of chamber jazz. We improvised. We played our own compositions. Violin, Jeff Gautier, bass, and piano and chromatic harmonica. My late friend, who was kind of my musical partner for about 17 years, named Eric Von Essen. And my brother had a special percussion setup for that band. So Quartet Music made 4 records, but I was still working in the jobs,
All this time you stayed in LA, I think you had a real awareness of what was going on in New York. I haven't heard you talk much about the downtown scene, but I imagine that there had to have been a part of you that was looking at what was coming out of New York all through the 80s and into the 90s with a certain amount of at least awareness. And you were certainly aware also of the avant-garde legacy of Chicago. I mean, you were aware of a lot of places that you could have gone. You did, and you stayed in LA, which is, of course, a completely reasonable thing to do. But I wonder if throughout those years, if there was a part of you that was wondering what it would be like if you left LA, eventually, much later in your life, you did.
Yeah, I'm a little sheepish talking about this. My family visited New York City in both 1967 and 1968. And then Alex and I went on a jazz pilgrimage there in 1976, thanks to our parents. And the loft scene was still happening. And And we went to Newport at New York. We went to the Herbie Hancock retrospective. We went to the Coltrane tribute with McCoy Tyner's band and Elvin Jones' band. When people would find out that you're a musician trying to play any kind of improvised music, jazz music, any kind of thing that was not rock, and you were from Los Angeles, there was quite often, I guess, a kind of what we now call like pushback, or an assumption made that there's no way it could be good because it's from Hollywood. People just think of Los Angeles as Hollywood or something. So I was very defensive about my hometown and very much trying to champion our people, like our friends that we played with, like Vinnie Golia and Bobby Bradford and John Carter and Wayne Peet and Stuart Liebig and all these people, Joe Berardi, all these people that I loved and respected, but whom were not known, or intentionally overlooked. Okay. So I became this kind of champion of Los Angeles world when this man, Milt Wilson, asked me to anchor a concert series at this place on Monday nights. He wanted me because he heard my band and also realized that I had friends who were interesting, who played music, and he called us something like the New Subterraneans. That's what he called us. And he wanted that energy in his place. Also, the place was extremely unsuccessful. So actually the Monday nights became his best night. From 1976 on, I wanted to live in New York. I wanted to live in New York City, honestly. And there are a million reasons why I didn't do it, even though we have a wonderful family friend that, we could sometimes stay with and whatnot. But it's a combination of the fact that I got married in 1981, my first marriage, and 4 years into, and we were really poor, okay, but 4 years into that, my wife was hit by a drunk driver and had a traumatic head injury that affected her for the rest of her life, and life became really difficult. And I think that along with my assumption that I didn't have what it took to make it in New York, playing the kind of music that I liked or that I was aspiring to play, those two things together kept me away. I definitely didn't want to drag her through trying to survive playing music in New York City. It would have blown her mind completely. She was already having so many struggles with anxiety, and her short-term memory was destroyed forever. But gradually I started playing with people, because I ended up playing with Julius Hemphill, for example. My brother played with Julius when he was 21 or something, because Julius came to Los Angeles. Our friend Lee, who we played with in high school, became obsessed with creative music and created a concert series. So we would be playing there. Julius came, Oliver Lake, Leo Smith, early efforts by Henry Kaiser and Wayne Horvitz, and Vinny would play, quartet music would play, Eric and I would do our duo. There was all kinds of stuff going on. Charlie Hayden now was living in Brentwood to be near his kids. So he and Bobby would play. I started playing with Charlie. So basically, this caused me to drift more towards New York, because Tim Byrne, for example, had asked Alex to form the bands for the first two records he did, because he was not a known entity in New York at the time, even though he's living in Brooklyn. He's always been the Brooklyn guy, way before everybody else. I'm on his second album, 7X.
I want to talk a little bit about the work with Wilco. Many people know you the most from that, and maybe come to follow you and your own music because they're such Wilco fans. It's a band that inspires enormous fanaticism and loyalty. It's been around for 30 years, the band. On top of all of these other collaborative projects that you're a part of, and all of the sort of the exploration that you're doing, you are also you belong to a team of people that are out here doing a thing, that come out every year and log a lot of miles and play a lot of gigs. And how does that fit into your general, the shape of your life being in Wilco?
Well, and I guess I sort of was drifting towards this when you asked about when I joined and why. But I mean, I really needed rescuing unless I was going to get another day job. And I was seriously, and I know this sounds like another apocryphal, overly dramatic moment, but I was driving back from yet another trip to the Bay Area, having played with Scott Amendola and with Jessica Lurie and singers or Scott's band, or we were playing in restaurants. It was like there was a .com bubble that was the first one there was work, and I had something like $800, and I was like, wow, man, $800, and I'm like realized like, oh gee, my rent's $600. And I was having trouble at that time making $600 a month rent. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I think I'm about to be 50 years old, and I think I really should think about a more surefire way to pay my bills. And my partner at the time, who always wanted me to do my own music and thrive, said, yeah, you're driving yourself insane with stress. Maybe you really should think about getting some kind of like regular work, so at least you know how much you're making every month. And I'm terrible with finances, and I have no hustle whatsoever. At one point, she wanted me to make a list of producers that I should try to contact for work. I said, oh man, it doesn't work like that, But anyway, I needed rescuing. So I was going to get a job. I thought like, well, I've only had cool jobs and never even had a cash register. We just had a cash drawer and handwritten receipts, and I have no skills, but maybe I could work at a Starbucks, so they'd probably train me and I could figure that out, and that's what I was thinking when Carla Boslich called me and said, you'll never believe who just called me, Jeff Tweedy. And quite honestly, I had been asked to do a couple of tours around this time with people that I didn't know. They wanted me to just go on tour, and both times or three times, I never really talked with the artist. And it was about 30 days before the tour was supposed to launch, and I wasn't interested, and I probably should have done them. But this time I thought, okay, Carl and I had been out opening for Wilco. I had met everybody, really liked everybody, and I knew that it would be a varied and basically unpredictable musical experience, and that's appealing. And I knew that everybody was a fantastic player. I hadn't met Patrick Sansone yet, because he and I now we're the new guys. In March it'll be 21 years with these same 6 individuals, and never thought I'd be doing it for 21 years, but I also didn't think it would be temporary. I just go one foot in front of the other. But quite honestly, it's just one of those very unusual situations where we like each other, and I'm proud of the work we're doing, and I really think the live shows are excellent. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that I'm a band guy. I mean, I always have been. So yeah, I'm a band guy.
Even going back to describing the early days with Alex, and then the bands that you had in high school and into Occidental, I mean, that's what you said. Well, I had a band, then we started a band, then we had a band. I mean, that was the impulse, always start a band, be in a band.
Yeah, the modular aspects of jazz, I think, are less appealing to me, but pretty much the way it's been going for the last many decades. But in earlier times, there were steady bands. The thing I've noticed about surviving and playing so-called jazz is that everyone has to go to Europe to do it for the most part. And then, if you're lucky, you go to Japan and whatever, you know what I'm saying? You're not going to make as much money playing in the United States. In fact, you can go hear most of the jazz geniuses of the day, the ones who still live in the New York City area, for virtually no money, because a lot of them just play for like pass the bucket at places they like, so they can just kind of experiment and keep their hand in and play. So we could play at Bar Lunatico, or we can go like Lowlands Bar or whatever, or the Stone. And I think that has made it so that promoters in Europe, they will have a lot of sway over what happens, because the festivals are the most successful, the most rewarding financially, and they don't want to see the same band over and over again. And I'm kind of bummed out by that, because it's sort of incumbent upon so many artists to come up with a new thing. And it's not even necessarily just new personnel. It's like a concept, let's say. and I have a new piece, and it's based on this novel by this, imprisoned Russian person, and now it's a sort of an opera, but it's not really an opera. But I have this incredible singer now I'm working with, and a string quartet. Like, oh wow, okay, I'll book that because that's new and fresh, instead of the same basic band that was there last year, which doesn't seem as interesting to promoters at this point, But then there are exceptions to this too, certainly. Like, even though the Bad Plus eventually changed, they're a band and a band that I admire. And so, there are a few exceptions. But if you think about the Miles Davis Quintet, either one of them, they went on for quite a while there, or Coltrane's quartet.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like the stories that I've heard about people who got to see those bands, and I can think of a handful of examples in my own life where I've gotten to see that. Actually, seeing Paul Motion was an example of that, I would say, where I had the feeling that I was I had the opportunity to drop in on these people that were working something out over a long period of time. And I was going to leave, and they were going to keep working it out. And the next set was going to start, and more people were going to come in, and they were going to continue to develop an idea that had taken a long time to develop and would continue.
So that's very well put.
You were maybe 5 years into your association with Wilco when you moved to New York. You moved here in like 2009.
Yes, that's when I met my wife, Yuka.
And that was the impetus. That was the thing that brought you
Well,
here.
no, so I'm finally going to move to New York. Yeah. And then, interestingly, a very well-known music journalist wanted to do a kind of a feature on my finally moving to New York. And when I told him, I said, well, I got to admit that I moved for love, not for the music scene, really. And that was the end of that story. I wasn't going to write about that. But, I'd already been playing here quite a bit.
I have to say, you're one of the few musicians of your generation, or maybe any generation, that I can think of who, when talking about the origin story of what drew you to play, it wasn't to get girls.
Nope. No, we blew that one right really early on. By the time we were 16 and our friends were all still following the Grateful Dead around or whatever, we had kind of shifted gears into permanently unpopular.
Yeah. Kind of nerd status in a way, I guess. When you moved here, eventually, I mean, you had been spending enough time here that you had a community of people. You talked about Tim Byrne, a lot of people that you worked with. You had recently met Yuka, and you started working together also. It doesn't seem like you have fully immersed yourself in one another's careers, but you do have a creative project together.
Spinning creatures so furry, psychedelic samadhi, spinning creature no hurry, sucking blanket holds the key, spinning creature so furry, psychedelic samadhi, spinning creature.
What is it like living with your creative partner, or your sometimes creative partner? What is that dynamic like?
It's really cool. Our trajectory and our methodologies are very different. And, in Yuka's case, she's particularly now the last few years, she's very focused on her solo eucademics, is what she calls it, her eucademics work. And it's electronic art, that's what she's doing. And she's also creating visual content where, when possible, it accompanies her performances. I was a very big fan of Cibo Matto, so it was kind of stunning to me that we would end up meeting, but this is also all Mike Watt's fault. He initiated a project called Floored by Four with Dougie Bound on drums, who's Yuka's ex-husband and also one of our best friends and favorite people on the planet, and Yuka and me and Watt. And we made this record that summer of 2009 in insane heat wave, played opening for M. Ward Summer Stage. And that's how Watt decided to initiate this. Matt Ward's a big fan of Watt and of yours truly. He's a really big Firehose fan. So he said, if you and Nels could do anything opening for me, I'd be happy. So that's when Watt decided it was his opportunity to try this quote unquote New York band that he had mentioned to Dougie and Yuka at a Stooges gig. also at this time, I was sharing just a little micro crash pad with Bill Frisell, because Bill was in New York so often, much more often than I was at this point, but we were just paying rent on this tiny apartment space in Carroll Gardens in a building that Jenny Scheinman had basically just populated with her friends as people would move out. So, and Jenny I had met playing with the Scott Amendola band, and we played a lot in California before she moved to New York.
So when you first moved here, I love this idea that you're sharing a micro crash pad with Bill Frisell, who you're both kind of bi-coastal or
yeah, he was in Seattle then.
Yeah.
Now he's, of course, in
Ditmas or...
Yeah, I met Bill in 1983 when I went to New York to audition to play in Paul Motion's band as the additional guitarist. Right after that, Paul shrunk down to the classic trio with Joe Lovano and Bill. And what was I going to do? Was I going to move to New York City? Maybe, I guess I was thinking about it, but this was before my first wife's injury. Her injury was in 1985.
To record on Blue Note as a solo artist is the top of the mountain of a certain kind of journey that a musician can go on. And after you moved to New York, not that long after you moved here, you find yourself making this series of Blue Note records, last of which is the one that brought us here to talk today. But the first one is Lovers, this larger format record.
Lovers, besides being something that was in my mind for probably about 25 years, starting in the 80s, was made possible by my friend David Breskin. David Breskin I met through Bill Frisell, actually, when he commissioned me to write music for a project that he had envisioned with Ed Ruscha artwork and his poetry called Baby. And we made the record, became friends. It came out from Prestel. It was a book including compact discs with him reading poetry and my music. I followed his directives as best as I could. Moving forward, he basically reinstituted his philanthropic organization called the Shifting Foundation that he had initiated in the 80s, but he reinstated it to make Lovers, which is a very, very expensive project to do with all these players and 5 days in the studio, an additional day for strings and harp. And long story short, it was recorded with the idea that this label that I had been on, not Cryptogramophone, Jeff Gautier's label, which basically was one of the greatest blessings of my life, is making all those Cryptogramophone records. It was going to be on a different label that I won't mention, and they never listened to it. So I was at that time being managed, kind of freshly managed by Tony Margarita Management, who also managed Wilco. And there was a man named Ben Levin, who was my day-to-day guy, young, very young at the time. And they suggested I self-release it. And then they would figure out a budget and I'd eventually make my money back. And they were convinced that this would fly. And so David and I got together. I had this artwork that I wanted for the cover all ready to go with my friend Angela Di Cristoforo's drawing. And we got together with, graphic designers and got it all buttoned up, ready to go. And lo, at some gig, I don't know what it was, Ben Levin was, after whatever this gig was, standing right next to Don Was, and just thought to say to him that, hey, I've got this guy I manage who does this and Scooby-Doo. And Don said, I want to hear that.
Was Don aware of you? Don aware of Wilco? Don aware of your other work?
That's a very good question. All I can say is that he's like really in my corner and one of the coolest dudes you'd ever want to meet. Really, really great. So that record was already finished before the Blue Note event. and a double album to boot. Really just a bizarre happenstance thing. And so they licensed it, and they licensed my records. And so every record, I basically get it to Don and Rachel and whomever and say, how about this one? And so far they say, great, let's just put it out. It's crazy.
What a wonderful dynamic. I mean, it gives you a little more responsibility in terms of getting these things made, but on the other hand, you can make whatever you want. It's a pretty fantastic situation.
I produce them, and then if for some reason at some point they say like, no, I'll just have to do something else. I'll straight to Bandcamp. I don't know.
Well, it seems that they're pretty open. Let's just arrive at the Consentrik Quartet record. It's quite a journey that you've been on in these 4 records in terms of the formats and the personnel and the sort of size and scale and even just kind of emotional space that you're in these records.
Well, it's nice to hear that you mentioned emotional things, because there's a lot of my music is emotion based. I'm not going for novelty necessarily, or innovation.
Well, let's talk about that. So as I understand it, and part of the reason I was aware of this question about New York and what it might represent to you is because it's alluded to at least in the press release or the liner notes of the record, this idea that New York loomed large for you, and that part of making this record is kind of in conversation with what New York represented to you. And some of the music emerged out of some experiences you had in Brooklyn before the pandemic, but then a lot of it emerged out of the isolation and space that you found yourself, as we all found ourselves with when we were sent to our rooms in 2020 for COVID.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I think that I didn't think about this at the time. It actually kind of occurred to me as I was in one of these conversations like we're having now about me talking about this record, that it really is a combination of the sudden quiet, the sudden stillness that we found ourselves in, and city noise. I mean, it's got it all. This said, I mean, I think that I have quiet, rubato, spacious pieces on all my records. And I tend to quip that they're the tracks that people skip, but they're usually my favorites.
Me too, man. Those are my favorites too.
Yeah. And my interest in that comes out of, listening to what we might broadly term classical music of people like Eric Satie or Maurice Ravel, or listening to Julian Bream play 20th century guitar and whatnot. Not some of that's really just spacious and still and harmonically rich, and then also listening to the Jimmy Giuffre 3 or chamber jazz, so-called, a lot of ECM music, and wanting that in my own music. I mean, it's just wanting to address that language in my own way, and then other songs are more demonstrative and more about who is playing. I want to make sure, because how much I love the people in this band and how much I love the people in the singers and how much I love everybody I play with, that they come to the fore and can be themselves and satisfy the music collectively, not just my artistic ambition, so-called, or dreams. And so those songs, I want to make sure that Ingrid Laubrock gets to play this way, or that Tom Rainey gets to really come to the fore here and everybody can hear what a genius he is, or, you know what I mean? So it's a combination of, I guess you might call it a kind of socialist organizing, and then my own sort of auteur-like didactic thing.
You make it very clear in that you really are hesitant to call anything a Nels Cline project. You want to acknowledge that it's a collective of people, so each one of your records, probably from a marketing standpoint, maybe is confusing. This record is only possible because it's the collective of these people making it. You want the listener to understand that.
I agree with what you're saying. I do have my name in all my bands when they're mine, but that wasn't even my initial impulse. When I started Nels Cline Trio, which was the most uninteresting name of all the bands. It was because the members of my trio told me that I couldn't call the band Bartholomew. And I don't know why I wanted to call it Bartholomew at this point, but they said, there's no way, you have to put your name in it, even though my name at the time was not known, you know. So I just kept that going, but I realize now on a marketing level or on a streaming service level that I'd have to not change the band name every time. So this time, the name of the record is the name of the band. But
very smart.
Just my name. And it wasn't my decision either. Well, it was my decision, but it was suggested that I not use the colon in between my name and Consentrik Quartet, that I just separate them and then have it be vague.
I think you're in good company, whoever's advising you. I think that's going to be useful long-term for people to find your work, because it's confusing when you go to a streaming service and you're looking for somebody's work. I mean, even, for example, something as simple as looking for the difference between Oscar Peterson Trio and Oscar Peterson. You know, those are organized different, so you can't find them in one place. So I think it's good that you...
I never knew this, you know, because I'm just not paying attention, apparently. So yeah. But then when I thought about it, I realized that after the Bill Frisell band, for example, or my dear friend and, you know, guitar hero Julian Lage, their records are all just their names, even though, you know, it might be Bill's 15th record with Tony and Kenny, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Or Julian's, you know, 4th one with Jorge and Dave King or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I realized that they might have some smarts there.
It takes a lifetime to catch up with this. And I guess, and that's what you're describing that we lack. In fact, I mean, I even thought about that when I realized that I was entering into your press cycle today. And I thought, God, you know, we all do this. You make a thing because it's who you are and it's what you do. And it's not necessarily intellectual. I mean, it's like, it's time to make a record. You're going to make a record. And then here you find yourself having to talk about it and figure out, what did I just do? And what do I mean by it? And, you know, I was thinking about that, just not only for you, but just the whole ecosystem of what this is very oftentimes very separate. One is I make a thing, as you said, you're emotionally driven. And then the other is the business of, now I have to explain what it was and why I did it and what I mean by it and why you should pay attention to it.
Right. Well, I never think about that part. That's the last part, you know, until I'm doing this. But I have to also say that the level of interest in this particular release seems kind of rather extraordinary to me. Huh. And so I'm astonished how many of these little chats I'm going to have over the next several days. And it's not normal for me.
What do you attribute that to? Do you have any sense
of
why?
I've been trying to figure it out. I actually have no idea. I was just talking to Yuka about it in the car yesterday, and we were driving up here from the city. I don't get it, but I'm happy. And my delightful management, they're happy. And it seems like the folks at Blue Note are psyched. I don't know if it's just timing or whether I waited a really long time to put out another record. You know, Share the Wealth came out. Well, there's an example of a record that doesn't sound like it's going to be on Blue Note, and it is. That's a pretty wild record in a lot of regards, sonically, maybe even stylistically. It came out the week after the 2020 election during lockdown. People were just trying to figure out how to do anything, you know, not let alone sell a record, you know. The thing I thought at that time was, well, hey, it's long. Like, all my records are pretty damn long. So, hey, everyone's sitting around at home. There's plenty to listen to there, right? But it just, I think it was not really particularly noticed because of what the timing was like. And then I didn't feel motivated to do another record right away of any sort. So it's been a while. It's, you know, I'm Julian and Bill probably both have 4 records out since Share the Wealth. You know, I mean, they're very prolific, maybe more than 4, you know. And this one took a while I was really taking my time, honestly, with this band. And we've hardly been able to play live, so I didn't want to rush it.
you mentioned Julian and Bill. They're contemporaries of yours in a way. Julian is interesting because he's so young and yet he's so influential, even to older musicians. They're all kind of in awe of him and dealing with him. But you're also collaborating with him. You made a duo record with him. He was in your quartet. I mean, you've had a very collaborative relationship with him. Are you watching other guitar players like Julian and Bill and sort of just taking stock of how they're operating relative to how you're operating? You're aware that they might be putting out more records than you?
Well, not really. Certainly, I mean, Bill's been on my radar since he first started playing with Paul,
Yeah.
And obviously I met him pretty early on. And then, when he formed the Bill Frisell band, and when you'd play in Los Angeles, we'd lend them gear, so, and here every time they played, and that band was really influential on my brain, on my aesthetics. And we're friends, at this point. And Julian and I met indirectly, I guess, in a way, through Jim Hall, because I started going to these. Brian Camilio from Artist Share started inviting me to these, what he called the crony lunches, which were literally a half a block down the street from where I was living in the West Village. And he had become aware of me in terms of relationship to Jim after I wrote a piece, I think it was for Jazz Times or Jazz's, I'm sorry, I can't remember now, called 10 Tracks by Whatever Artist You Pick. And I picked Jim Hall. And Jim apparently really liked what I wrote, and so did Brian. So he invited me to these things. And then I kept hearing Julian this, Julian that. And I was like, who the hell are they talking about, this Julian? I didn't know who he was at all. So no, I wasn't paying attention to a super amazing young guitarist named Julian Lage at that time. I went back and did a YouTube search. And then I picked my jaw off the floor, and then eventually met this young man at one of these lunches. And really, it's like ridiculous, but the rest is history, because I was really fried on touring and on myself, and I was in kind of a slump, I guess you'd say, and I was very fatigued and thinking of doing a drumless chamber jazz type project. But then we just started improvising one day, and that was it. I just thought, I was going to have a cellist, and I was going to do this and that. And then Bruce Galanter at Downtown Music Gallery asked me to play at a benefit at LPR. And I thought, oh, dude, I will do this trio idea, and I'm going to write this music, and a Julian and a cellist. And well, the cellist couldn't make the date. And I remember asking Julian, I said, should we just do this as a duo? And the only reason I was asking is because I'd done so many guitar duos. And not that I initiated all of them, but I played duo with Elliott Sharp. I did 3 recordings with him, I believe, with Thurston Moore, with G.E. Stinson, with Jeremy Drake. I'm sure I'm forgetting some now, but I just thought, can I do another guitar duo? And even though this was going to be completely different, we weren't going to play, I wasn't going to use any effects whatsoever. Yeah. We even stopped using any reverb, anything. We didn't even use tuners. We used tuning forks. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my entire musical life. It's almost some of the best playing I think I've ever done, because there's something about playing with Julian that makes me very relaxed. In spite of the fact I know that he has the technique to pretty much bury everybody. It was just so, there was such strong chemistry. So of course I listen to everything he does because I admire him so much. But there's so many other guitarists that I'm not caught up with. My point is that I have a lot of work catching up to do,
Nels, I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to talk to me today. And I congratulate you on this new record.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
Okay, Leo, later.
There he was, my friends, Nels Cline. I love that story. I'll be back again in your headspace with another deep dive before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a WBGO Studios production. To learn more about WBGO Studios' award-winning podcasts, special concerts, live streams, and more, visit wbgo.org/studios.